In the 2010s, Denver built a massive expansion of its rail system, with extensions of various electric light rail lines and new, modern electric suburban rail lines that are some of the nicest in the US. But ridership didn't really materialize. In a region of over 3 million people, less than 300,000 take the trains and buses every day. There was even an entire NPR podcast about the anticlimactic sputter of ridership the system garnered. Now, this might sound like a unique Denver-specific case, but I assure you it isn't. All across the US, there are tons of transit projects that have got huge funding and then generated unimpressive ridership. That's before they often slip into a slow, depressing decay. But as it turns out, there's a common thread that links these projects. Let's talk about what it is. Welcome to RM Transit, where I talk about public transportation and when it sometimes doesn't live up to the hype. When the current US president swept into power and the US government started sending out money for rail projects fast and furious, there was naturally a ton of excitement. But what's concerning is that if we spend a ton of money and it all turns out like Denver's Fast Track's rail expansion project, well, that would be a waste of money. And it would probably also turn people off of the idea of investing in transit. So identifying the issues in the transit we build is critical to making sure we don't kneecap it and we can get more of it in the future. And I think there are really two huge problems at the core of this, at least in the US. I've already talked about the cost of building transit, and I have a ton of videos about that. But today's video is going to be focused on the dollars not going as far because, well, people aren't getting on the trains and buses. The obvious thing that probably jumps out at you if you follow urbanism and transit is land use. So often, transit gets built out and then it gets surrounded with parking lots that don't make transit a regular part of people's day-to-day lives, don't put much of anything very close to transit stations, and certainly don't leave people living next door. And this is a huge issue. In Denver, the problem is often worse, where empty lots frequently surround new rail stations. But of course, with an empty lot, the opportunity is even higher. A potential solution to this can be found warehouse in British Columbia, Canada, home of the SkyTrain and a hockey team that never wins. British Columbia and Vancouver specifically have been in a housing crisis for decades, but the government is finally stepping up, and some of the new policies they've created would be incredibly valuable to apply broadly in the United States and Canada. Essentially, the rules work so that land near train stations and even bus exchanges are automatically upzoned to allow for towers in the adjacent blocks and lower but still high forms of density in the surrounding mile or so circle around the stop or station. Having a higher level of government implement a policy like this, at least for transit projects going forward, as opposed to all projects retroactively, which would be the gold standard, would lead to a ton of progress. For communities that desperately need the housing, it creates certainty and gets the zoning regulations out of the way. And at the same time, it makes sure that particularly NIMBY communities don't get federal or state dollars to build a nice train that doesn't get all that much ridership because not that many people live near it. Rich NIMBY type folks generally are smart enough to realize that a train station in their neighborhood is going to help their property values. It's important that this is done by higher levels of government because they're somewhat immune to the localism issue. Higher level governments don't care about the differences in density from one block to the next. And local politicians who are dealing with a policy from above that says they must upzone near transit can tell local residents that it's out of their hands. This is the most fair way that ensures upzoning happens logically, and upzones aren't just given to, say, a well-connected developer. At the same time though, building regulations need to be updated. Far too often someone moves into, say, a new apartment building near a BRT, but after riding the BRT for a few commutes they realize it's not all that fast. And so they buy a car and park it in the parking garage underneath the apartment that the government mandated. Removing parking minimums or even creating parking maximums helps create pressure. People don't have a car at hand, and so they're forced to take action and push for better, faster transit. And since most people won't have cars, there will be an obvious and substantial market for those transit services. Now, of course, land use has a ton to do with the problems transit often faces, but I think it actually might be a little bit overrated in 2024. Now that everyone and their mom is a YIMBY, housing is on most people's minds to some extent. But I think the degree to which transit projects aren't doing well because there's an apartment building on top of every stop is probably overrated. It's actually discussed in the podcast, but you can see it around Denver too. There are actually a ton of new apartments popping up near train stations, albeit usually with parking. So it's not like the reason that nobody is riding is because there are zero transit-oriented places to live. One person that was interviewed basically just said that transit is less convenient than driving. It's kind of funny, but everyone who knows transit knows it has to be frequent to be successful, Switzerland accepted. But service on so many of our new transit projects, including Denver's new rail lines, just isn't very good. Now, of course, people will tell you that every 30 minutes or every hour is a pretty good service, because compared to nothing, it is pretty good. But 30-minute or hourly service is not going to get people out of their cars, and it's amazing when people tell me this is okay, and then come with me to a city with decent service and go, oh my goodness, it's so easy to use transit. Yes, because it's frequent. I find it crazy how little we talk about the fact that service levels on new transit projects are just not very good. Everyone knows that transit should be frequent, but if new projects don't have frequent service or have weird hours like a reduced frequency after 8 p.m. as if people don't need to travel around in the evening, well then obviously people aren't going to use it. The podcast, for example, identifies that Denver has lots of busy bus routes, and identifies that the suburban train routes are often not very busy. But it almost seems to imply that the reason the rail routes aren't busy is because they just go on corridors where there isn't any demand for transit, when in reality the reason the buses are well used is because they're frequent. They're not a terrible experience to use, and so naturally people use them. Speed also plays a role, and it will be no secret to viewers of this channel that a lot of the street-adjacent light rail we build in North America is just not all that fast, often no faster than a bus in its own lane. And since we've built a lot of this really slow light rail in cities where drivers have access to high-speed freeway networks, it really shouldn't be all that surprising that people aren't choosing to go the slow way. But even when a city like Denver runs its trains along the highway, it doesn't feel like it's for a good reason, say to hit some huge density and population jackpot just a little over yonder. It seems that rails are typically just slapped down where they fit, not where it's going to lead to faster transit or a better experience for riders. Much like with housing, if higher orders of government are going to bring huge amounts of capital funding for transit, then lower level municipal and county governments need to make commitments about service, or they have to negotiate for higher levels of government to pay for it. And there needs to be a plan to maintain service levels when things go awry, say with the economy. When the economy is down, that's when you need transit the most, because people are trying to save money and scrimp and save. But that's so often when transit service in the US gets completely slashed. Basically, funding a new transit project should come along with broad ironclad agreements that transit is going to follow a fast alignment, hit key population centers, have housing built around it, and always maintain a minimum reasonable frequency, say every 15 minutes from morning to night. Much like if you aren't going to build the housing, if you're not going to run the service, transit money should go elsewhere. You can see all of this in action on Denver's R-Line, which largely runs through Aurora and was mostly built as part of the Fast Tracks plan. At the southern end of the line, it runs in a highway median, which is not a great place for waiting for a train, but there's at least a park and ride, separating this station from nearby residents. The next stop is once again in the middle of an interstate, and once again there is a ton of parking. In this case, an entire parking garage. In fact, most stops on this route have a huge parking lot despite not having any housing directly next to the stop. The next station is on the side of a highway interchange, Progress. But since it's next to a huge interchange, most of the places you can walk to from the stop are highway. Fortunately, the line does eventually leave the highway after another stop, where you can smell the sweet, sweet aroma of car exhaust, but only to make two painfully slow 90-degree turns around a shopping mall, slowing the trains down in order to serve mostly parking lots. People would have to walk across them to actually go to the mall. Fortunately, before long, the line turns back west with more slow 90-degree turns, not stopping near the actually already existing residential areas before returning to the highway right-of-way to zig and zag along it. For the few areas where the line actually runs near residential neighborhoods, it's often divided from them, either by a freeway or a park and creek. And the frequency is every 30 minutes. It should be no wonder that ridership is poor when there is almost no good reason for someone to use it. You probably don't live near it. If you do, it's a very long walk. Once you get to the stop, it's a very long wait. And once you're on the train, it won't be particularly fast. That does not sound like a recipe for success to me. Governments are putting up record amounts of funding, but they need to ask for accountability from lower levels of government, as well as from state agencies and those actually planning transit. Without housing, transit won't be near all that much, and without good service, it won't be very useful. Historically, these have often been seen as nice-to-have externalities, but they are fundamental to the proposition of mass public transit. Mandating these supportive policies would be higher levels of government helping lower levels of government help themselves. And when a transit project is successful, the benefits are actually realized instead of it all going to waste. Emissions are cut, affordability is increased, and people can get around more efficiently. Thanks for watching.